NATO here. I just want to leave a thought with you guys real quick. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. The friend of my enemy is my enemy. The friend of my friend is my enemy. The enemy of my friend is my friend. And the friend of my enemy is their enemy. This is going to be a video about American foreign policy currently. I'm not going to be able to go into the last 70 years of American foreign policy because it's really, really sad. I can tell you just really quickly that the problems we have in the Middle East are 100% caused by the United States and Great Britain, stemming from the 1950s coup. The Persian prime minister, the democratically elected parliamentary government in Tehran, was overthrown by the British and the United States governments in the purpose of controlling their oil. All other problems in the Middle East stem from this exact moment in time. Is there a solution? Yes. Do I have it? I think so. There's no time to get it all through in tonight. But one thing I do want to talk about, as a list of those proofs of friends, enemies, and enemies of enemies, and friends and enemies, and is that our perception of who our friends and who our enemies are is really convoluted. We really haven't had a rational evaluation of who our friends and enemies are. We can't go full steam ahead against someone and say they are the enemy, because in other aspects they are a great friend and great ally. And we can't say they are our best friends, we love these guys, because they will stab us in the back the second we turn around. That's the reality of it. What I want to talk about really quickly is just the relationship the United States has with Russia and with China. These are the big boogeymen of foreign policy for the United States right now, according to John McCain and Jeff Flake and a lot of other people who think they're more important than what they really are. In the grand scheme of things, they have probably caused more problems than they've ever solved. Since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the United States has had a very, very staunch policy of trying to flip former Soviet states to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the European Union, and to go against Russia. This is because the mentality and the mindset of the Cold War was either you're with the United States or you're with the Soviet Union. You could not be with both. There was a small group of states called the Non-Alignment Pact that tried to play both sides, but they didn't do so well in the long run. In fact, Persia, then becoming Iran, and then the placement of Saddam Hussein into Iraq to fight the Persians, and then the reason why he went into Kuwait, and then the reason why we had Desert Storm, and the creation of the Taliban and Mujahideen and the power struggle and the development of Al-Qaeda all comes from the United States and the Soviet Union playing a chess game across the globe. All of it. But since the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States has still had the mindset of you're either with the United States or you're with the Russians. The Russians were in a mess in the 90s, but kind of had the same stance. Either with the United States or you're with the Russians. The United States has tried to go in and overthrow, through the colored revolutions, many of the former Soviet republics into more pro-Western governments. This has succeeded in some instances and have failed in others. What it has done is it put Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in the NATO victory column. However, it created within them ethnic cleansing mentalities to where they are very anti-Russian and ethnic minorities within their countries. This is against what the United States says that it is for. It is for everyone being equal, for free expression of ideas within these countries. to be pro-Western, to be pro-US, pro-NATO, pro-European Union, they have developed, because of the Cold War mindset, to be anti-Russian. So any ethnic Russians in those countries aren't treated very well and are basically second-class citizens. I have traveled throughout the world. This is something that is a problem, and it needs to be addressed. A lot of these government overthrowings have been done through clandestine organizations that have come through either non-governmental organizations or some type of charity event or some other type of Western alliance organization coming into those countries and then shuffling money to opposition groups. That's the reason why Russia has banned all American NGOs, most Western NGOs, because all of them have been shown to have some type of correlation with the more money going through them and governments being overthrown. This was attempted to be done in Macedonia, Montenegro, and in Ukraine. The United States, under Barack Obama, even admitted that they had attempted to supply opposing Kremlin forces to remove a democratically elected president, which is a pro-Russian president in Ukraine, or a pro-Western president. They supplied these guys with money. They supplied them with equipment. They supplied them with everything they needed. And what you end up having was a civil war in Ukraine that the United States admitted they lost control of. Then you had John McCain going over there trying to state all these things about how the U.S. is a great ally of Ukraine, and he was in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia saying the same. Most Americans couldn't point to you where Ukraine or Lithuania, Latvia, or Estonia are on a map. Okay? They have no idea the ethnic background of Ukraine, the fact that half of Western Ukraine was Poland prior to 1939, and there's a large Hungarian minority, and in the eastern part of Ukraine is ethnically Russian. And the Crimea isn't either ethnically Russian or Ukrainian, and it's Tatar, a Turkic group of people. America doesn't have enough understanding of the historical events that led up to the nation-state developments of these areas to have a say, or even should they have a say, in how these nations govern themselves. But the mentality is Russia's the enemy. They have completely ignored China over the last 60 years, and now China has more of a leg up, more competition ability, and ability to wipe our influence off the face of the earth. Why? Because we didn't pay attention to them. We didn't look at them as being a potential adversary. We saw them as being cheap labor. We saw them as being easily manipulated. The Chinese are not easily manipulated. I've met tons of them. That's not their mentality. The Russians aren't pushovers either. They're not going to allow anyone to come into Russia and tell them how to govern themselves. And for what works for Russia, what works for the United States, aren't the same. The people are different. The mentality is different. Even though the cultures have similarities with Christianity and being, of that sect of being of European, that's kind of where the limits are. Culturally, historically, they're very different, but they're not inherently adversaries eternally. They're just not. The Soviet Union was the anti-capitalistic state. The United States is the anti-communist state. Russia is not the Soviet Union. They are not trying to promote communism worldwide. So in that case, the U.S., you won. Move on. But the United States has continuously placed military bases along the Russian frontier in a containment status against the Russians. What this has created has been a hostility and an ability for the Russian politicians to rally around the flag that the United States is the enemy and that we must do these things with an iron fist to protect our sovereignty. Okay, that's how the Russians govern themselves. Is I can't give you this, great domesticated luxuries because we got to build more tanks and missiles and military equipment because we are literally being surrounded. If you know a lot about Russian history, you know that the Russian government, through Muscovy, through back as far as the Kievan Rus, times to the Russian Empire. It was all about trying to create a buffer zone from the outside because Russia has been invaded by everybody more than once. And so this is part of the Russian mentality, and the U.S. doesn't really have this because the only one who's really invaded the U.S. has been the U.S. itself. Okay, and so we're missing this part of their thought process when we look at the military engagements. Russia right now is more of an ally against Islamic radicalism and a lot of other really, really bad things going on around the world than they are an adversary against it. Our major adversary right now economically and over influence is with China. China's taking over large parts of Africa with their influence and their money. The Russians never really did that. The Chinese are starting to look into making deals with people in South America. Soviet Union kind of did that, but only because the enticement of communism worked within the Catholic Church in South America, not because they actively tried to make them part of the Soviet International. Because communism in the Soviet Union was atheist, communism in South America was Catholic. Okay, there's differences in the way the communism and religion worked in those different areas. They're not the same. Right now, a lot of things that we want to do, we can't get done internationally because of the UN. The UN has its 5 permanent members, China and Russia being 2 of them, Great Britain, France, and the US being the other 3, that both sides can counter and veto what the other side wants to do. When it comes to trying to contain China economically, we can't go through it with, bold forward movements because they are also our adversary, they're our allies on some aspects, and we cannot compete with them economically right now. It's just not possible. But too much of our stuff is made there. And we can't counter them because it'll cause a trade war, and it's just not something the U.S. can do anymore. We also need their assistance in dealing with North Korea. At the same time, the Russians, we make them the bad guy all the time. The Chinese and the Russians don't always get along, with the exception of when they're voting against the United States. And the Russians can do things that we can't with the Chinese. We can make them economic competitors, and while they're busy trying to compete with each other, we can make moves and strides to regain the influence the U.S. had across the world. We should do this not because we want to restabilize and make Russia a more powerful country. We should do this because by having Russia reassert itself in the world, it can help balance against China. And if they're competing with each other more than they are now, one, we might be able to break their alliance in the UN, the past resolutions. We might get one of the other one to pressure North Korea into dropping their nonsense, maybe even to take North Korea out for us so we don't have to. That's something we should look at doing. We could build factories in Russia with our multinationals and have them stimulate the Russian economy, being able to compete with the Chinese economy directly without us necessarily having to look like we're trying to start a trade war. The Russians and the Chinese can compete with each other culturally for the Central Asian states, for trade with India and Southeast Asia. As something that both of them have shown interest in doing, and by making them compete with each other over these areas, it allows the United States to codify the areas that we currently have control over, but might lose to China if we're not able to counter them in a successful way. How we do this is a couple of things. One, the U.S. really has no interest in controlling Ukraine or who Ukraine does trade with. We also really have no need to get involved with Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania and their economic deals. We should pull back the NATO forces out of the Baltics and out of the Ukraine, and we should stop trying to fund the right fascist entities in the current Ukrainian government. There's no benefit, long-term benefit, to having a military conflict with Russia over Ukraine. Ukraine and Russia are culturally tied. There's too many Russians living in Ukraine. There's too many Ukrainians living in Russia for us to ever be able to completely separate the two. Let Russia take it. It's just going to make everyone else's lives easier. The one thing we should have to watch out for now is that the cleansing and the removal of people from their homes prior to the 2014 conflicts. That should be our only goal, to make sure that the conflict doesn't escalate again in Ukraine. We should pull our forces back out of the immediate Russian sphere of influence, which is the former Soviet states. Pull back our line to the pre-1989 borders, because Russia's not going to invade Poland. Why would they? Russia's not going to invade Czech Republic or Slovakia. Why would they? There's no benefit in it if they're not being threatened from those areas. Okay? Another problem we have is that we can't do trade necessarily with Russia because we have trade restrictions against Russia for the Crimea. And Congress probably will not let the U.S. unilaterally take those out, at least by the president. But we have something that we can use to get around that. The Commonwealth of Independent States was an attempted entity by Yeltsin to replace the Soviet Union with just a different flag. Same country, just different flag. And removing Gorbachev as the supreme leader and replacing with himself Yeltsin. The CIS consists of all the former Soviet republics with the exception of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. They have a unified trade agreement, and we can get around the sanctions with Russia by dealing directly with the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS. This would also allow us to kind of prop up other weaker states within the CIS, like Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan with their oil. We could also develop some influence within Ukraine, but we have to be careful not to show that we're trying to influence the political decisions directly, but through economic influence, we can make some movements and gains there. And that should be the long game with the CIS. We get around the Russian sanctions to be able to build and trade with Russia, building up their economy and allowing them to compete with China, helping us take away some of China's steam and economic development from China by competing with them in developing areas like India, Bangladesh, Southeast Asia, and in Africa. By making Russia more powerful, it's not our goal to empower them, but it is our way to countering the Chinese growth without being directly confrontational. That's the way we should look at our foreign policy between the Russia and the Chinese. Also, by giving up and moving our elements away from Ukraine and out of the former Soviet states, we could tell Putin, we will do this, but we need to remove the North Korean regime. We need to stop this. And Putin, who's already going to be looked at as the bad guy, might have enough gall to go in and take them out, saying that it's causing destabilization in the region, that it's affecting the Russian economy, and what are the Chinese? The Chinese aren't going to necessarily try to go push the Russians out of North Korea, primarily because why? Russia, for the Chinese, primarily is not considered to be an adversary. So their buffer zone against South Korea and the West would still be intact. And currently, as we speak now, a good chunk of the Chinese military is Russian-made or licensed and is slightly outdated compared to what the Russians have and have developed. So they're much more, in reality, equally compared to each other than what we think they do. And Russia could balance out the Chinese dragon, as you say. And that's what we should do. We should concentrate on balancing out the world, keeping China somewhat on a short leash with using the Russian bear, and using that time to develop better relationships with the areas that we're losing our strength with, mostly countries like South America. And we should start looking into helping Africa, not so much with this giving them handouts, but through contracts with building infrastructure and trying to create more independent, stable economies within Africa that have a tendency to favor the U.S. involvement versus the Chinese. That's our goal. And then also with the Russians, we have and the Chinese, we need to address the Islamic fundamentalism that's growing across the world. It's affecting the Chinese and the Russians as much as it is the United States. All three powers should concentrate on putting a stop to this. And with the strengthening of the Russian influence in Central Asia, you're going to see hopefully a development of a more pro-Russian, pro-centric Russian state with Orthodox Christianity deals, and which would supersede and cover up the development of some of the Islamic fundamental creativity in the area. During the Soviet government, the Central Asian states were Islamic. They had issues with them, but the Soviet government, through the ideology and identity of the Soviet, was able to curtail that behavior. And I think by putting them back into somewhat of a controlling position in those areas, we're going to start to curtail the Islamicization of Central Asia, liberating their economies and allowing trade to flow through there again, which would benefit everyone. It's not going to affect so much the America First platform of the U.S. president. It will just help expand global trade there, primarily to eliminate the need for Islamic radicalization due to poverty and lack of resources and opportunities. So that's kind of in the nutshell of my foreign policy platform. I tried to make a short video, and this was longer than the last one, so I do apologize, but these things aren't simple. If you have any comments, please leave them down below, and until next time, peace out.